start this amazing event, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight our view to speaker view. Let's see, is that we are live on, let's go here. Alrighty, everybody, Eddie Chavez Calderon here with Uri Litzetic, and in partnership with Arizona Jews for Justice and Valley Beit Midrash. We are super excited to see all of you joining us here today, and super excited to have one of our great friends that has really helped us in really diving into these deep conversations. I want to first introduce kind of the schedule of today's event to help give y'all an idea of what's going to happen here. So we're going to start off with our great introductions of both of our speakers today. Rabbi Shmuley, my great mentor, is going to lead us with some amazing Torah to help ground us, right? Because we're grounded with Torah. We know that we're going to be walking with all of our Torah text study that really emphasizes why we do our work that we do and why we need to elevate. And then our great friend Ilana Kaufman is going to lead us through a short presentation. And then we're going to be moving to the discussion part of our segment. This is where we're really going to ask, what are some concrete questions? What are some concrete asks that allows us to move from not just being against racism, but being anti-racist? So I want to introduce first my great friend and mentor, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, who's going to lead us through some Torah. And then, Rabbi, as soon as you're done, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ilana Kaufman. So as soon as you're done, I'll jump in and introduce Ilana Kaufman.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Eddie, for all the work you've been doing to lead this anti-racism campaign we've been doing over this last year and beyond. And it's great to be with Ilana Kaufman again. We had her at VBM. It was just rocked our world, and just so inspired by her leadership and her scholarship. And it's great to be with all of you. So thank you for being here. You know, I'm one of these traditional Jews that believes that the primary vehicle of Jewish life is the mitzvah. Understood in the pluralistic fashion, however we understand it, is the mitzvah. It's the deed. Because this is halachta b'drachav, it's imitatio Dei. The first thing we learn about God in the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'taaretz, that God creates the world. God acts. And so to be godly is to act. That's not to say that Jewish identity doesn't matter. It's not to say that the realm of belief doesn't matter, but that the most primary vehicle in Jewish life is the realm of action. What are we going to do based on our values, right? It's not just a Facebook post. It's not just a bumper sticker. How am I going to live my truth? And on this case, if we believe human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, what am I going to do every day to fight for that truth? What am I going to do to fight for the image of God that is in every human being, especially those who have been historically and are current under most threat? And as Eddie opened up, it's not enough for us to say, I'm not racist. It's not enough, firstly, because it's not true, that all of us have biases that we have to spend a lifetime of work to uproot. This work that we have, as we emerge in systems of white supremacy, to do that work of uprooting these biases. So it's not enough to say, I'm good, the problem's out there. And secondly, it's that the goal is higher than not being racist, as Eddie said. Then how do we move towards allyship, and how do we move the allyship to actually act against these barriers, act against these forms of hate that are visible and in many ways invisible, the systemic realm. We often talk about social justice, but the other two realms of justice are equally as important here. Distributive justice, how we think about economics, and criminal justice, how we think about policing and mass incarceration. So to think about the social justice, the distributive justice, the criminal justice. And we believe that to do this work means that we have to be vulnerable, because we're going to mess up. Things are changing, we are learning, and to put ourselves out there and to take a stand means we're gonna kind of sometimes get beat up a little bit. We're gonna make mistakes, and that's what it means to do this work together, to hold each other in our learning and in our challenging, and to see that this is what the mitzvot ask of us, is to each day act and then reflect, and act and then reflect. And that's what happens in the story of creation, that God creates the world and then steps back. And so too, as partners in creation, and seeing that we can do this in our families, we can do this in our communities, we can do this in society at large. And the last thing I'll say before we go on to Ilana is the Baal Shem Tov famously taught that the great evils that bother us in the world, as they should, are really mirrors to our soul as well. They're mirrors to our soul. It's the work that we need to do. We can never only point at evils out there, that the spiritual work and the justice work are intertwined. That's to say that what we're fighting for out there, we have to do that work inside as well, in terms of how we're going to uproot these biases and these stereotypes and these forms of racism that we ourselves have inherited and that we have become complacent to. And as Elie Wiesel is famously quoted as saying, that silence helps only the oppressor. Interesting enough, his son wrote an article just 2 weeks ago saying that his father always gets quoted for that line. He was also a master of silence. And so indeed, there are times in our lives we should be masters of silence. And yet we have to also ask ourselves, where am I too silent? Where am I too silent in the face of this? And so it's a great honor and delight to learn from Ilana Kaufman today on these issues, and then to engage collectively in conversation and in questions to think, how can we push to the next level? We're at a critical moment where we can't let this energy die down, of how collectively can we take this movement to the next level. Ilana Kaufman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank
Right
you,
on.
Rabbi.
Julie, thank you, Eddie. And just I want to say thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers facilitated by Eddie. Eddie, you're becoming quickly one of my favorite people to do questions and answers with out there, because you push it and you ask juicy questions, and so I'm just looking forward to that opportunity with you. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen. We'll do some presenting for a little bit, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Let's see here. This is going to take me a second. I'm not great at it. Slideshow from beginning. And let me change my display setting. Eddie, do you see the correct first slide up?
I sure do. You're good to go.
All right, let's do this thing. Great. Okay, so my name is Ilana Kaufman. I'm the executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative. Very quickly, we do just 3 things, and we try to stay in our lane because we only do these things well. We run the nation's only philanthropic fund for Jewish people of color, and we focus on the areas of field building. So we support identity development and strengthening, leadership development, supporting and implementing standards of best practice. We support knowledge and research creation, and we support policy and practice out there. And so any of that work deeply, deeply tethered to and connected to, led by centering Jews of color, we are excited about supporting through grants. The second thing we do in the country is we do research on behalf of the community. And so we have the privilege of listening to what your questions are, and then going out and commissioning research to find the answers. Our first study was called Counting Inconsistencies, and it looked at all of the community studies from the federations across the country to help give us a sense of the number of Jewish people of color in the United States. We'll talk about that in just a second. And we're like 4 months into our second study, which I'm really excited about, which is now that we know how many Jews of color there are, and that's an undercount. And again, I'll talk about that in just a second. What are the experiences of us, of Jewish people of color? What are our perspectives? What do you need to know to inform your organizations, your programs, your strategies that you actually don't know because you haven't asked, because Jewish people of color aren't there? And we have the privilege and the opportunity to help bridge that gap with data. We're going to be delivering that data around the Chagim in the fall. And I'm really, really looking forward to not only sharing that data, but hopefully anybody who self-identifies as a Jewish person of color, we're going to invite you to participate and making sure your voice is heard. And so we're really excited about that. And then the last thing we do is community education. And what I want to say is we're terrible at diversity training. We don't do any cultural competency training. That is not our strength. There are colleagues out there who do it much, 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 much better than we do. We stay in our lane and we talk about the data. We work with boards, leadership groups, fellowships, leaders of the mega and meta organizations in our space, and we bring them the information they need to help really grapple with what it's going to mean to shift their paradigm. Like, what does it really mean to have to think about moving from an identity that one is largely conceived of as white and moving into one that is clearly multiracial? How do we understand ourselves and moving from a space that is not only Oshka normative, but I would suggest Oshka centric, And how do we move into an environment where we recognize, quite frankly, never mind like Ashkenazi, Sephardi, the diversity of Jewish ethnicity out there is vast. And this Ashkenacentrum that we have connected to in the United States, and I'll talk about in a second, it has flattened Jewish identity in the United States across the board, Jews of color notwithstanding. And so, you know, the opportunity we have to be able to talk about these things, to help our leaders really grapple with these things in environments that can make them vulnerable. And where they have to kind of go deep about what it really means to move their organizations into ones that see themselves as multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-denominational. That's the work that we get to do. And I'm very, very privileged to be able to do that and to be with you this morning. Let's jump into the numbers. Let's jump into the numbers. Okay, and some of this is available on our website. We have slides available for you if that's of interest. And so like only take the notes that you want right now. There are something like 7 million people who are Jewish in the United States. That number 7 million includes young identify as people of color in the United States. And that people of color identity, our Jews of color identity, sort of maps neatly on top of the US structure of racial identity as informed by racial stratification, the invention of race and racism in the United States, and the context, which is tightly US centric, but there's a context where we understand ourselves as people of color in the United States. We see ourselves as Black and brown, we see ourselves as Asian, we see ourselves as Native, as Indigenous, as First Nation, as multiracial, as Pacific Islander. All of these identities, Jewish and kind of constitute Jewish people of color in the United States. So again, there's at a minimum something like 1 million. So if you're looking on this screen and there are, oh, I can't see my number box right now, but let's say there are 28 people on this screen, there should be at least be, you guessed it, 4 people of color, right? And so let's start doing the math. And every time we're in a Jewish environment, we should look around and go, people are missing. Where's our family of color? Where's our queer and trans family? Are there enough women here? Are there enough people who are gender non-binary here? Is everybody here and who's missing? These numbers also tell us that something like 20% of the US Jewish community self-identifies as multiracial families. So these are families where you might have a white person show up to synagogue or a white person show up to your environment, but they aren't showing up with white eyeballs in that way. They're showing up thinking, is this space safe for my family? Is my partner going to be welcome here? Will my kids be welcome here? When my partner who's African-American comes to daven, will they be racially profiled on their way into shul? Is this environment not only welcoming, but deeply inclusive of different cultural aesthetics, different ways of being, different understandings of approaches to thinking about Jewish identity? So our multiracial families are walking into our spaces asking those questions, even if it's only the white person of the family showing up in your environment. If you live on a coast, if you live in the West, if you live in the East, that number of 20% is actually 25%. So 1 in 4 of your families self-identifies as multiracial. Now, if you're one of those, I'm going to say it, rare Jewish families at this point that just only has white people in it, like somehow has defied the physics of the United States, has defied the physics of just being in a multiracial nation, and somehow there's only white folks around, the data tells us you're like 1 grandbaby, 1 cousin, 1 niece or nephew away from being part of that 20%, part of that 25%. And so there are fewer and fewer families in the US Jewish community who just have white people in them. And if you think about it, it's a little bit of an anomaly. Like, how in the world, in an entirely multiracial environment, in a country that's predicated on the physics of people commingling, like how in the world did anybody's family end up just white? Like, it's a fascinating question. Every minion, every day school classroom, every board, if you've got more than 7 people, if you've got 10 people, if you've got 20 people, you should have people of color in those spaces. And then let's give a real kind of crystalline example of how this all plays out. Numbers inform representation. Numbers inform allocations. And so when you think about the relationship between like funders and philanthropy, and when you say, oh, there are 12 to 15% Jewish people of color in the United States, like we should assume something like 12 to 15% of funding should be going to Jewish people of color, or in an equity practice, we might say 30% should go to Jewish people of color, because there has been a paucity of resources given to Jewish people of color in advance of this moment. In a very specific context, in response to COVID, the organized US Jewish community amassed a $91 million fund to support our Jewish organizations as we try to survive, and we are trying to survive through COVID. Of that $91 million, 0.0049% went to Jewish people of color. And so it just gives you a sense of, how is this sort of this proportional relationship between population, a commitment to racial equity and justice, and allocating of community resources playing out? We can see it plays out in disproportionate ways. We should be thinking about strategically supporting Jews of color who are leading other Jews of color to support Jews of color. We should be supporting them with resources, with tools, with support. We should also be supporting our white community colleagues who are supporting Jews of color, but we need to recognize, in some ways, like the Maimonides ladder of giving, there is a hierarchy. There is a hierarchy, and we should be empowering Jews of color to lead on our own. We should be empowering Jews of color to have the expertise on what they think of for their own Jewish community. And we should be helping our white leadership not only be good allies, but to reach for other colleagues of color who can speak for, represent, and lead on behalf of the community in a more inclusive way. Where are we going over time? By 2042, the United States will be a majority people of color, somewhere between 2042 and 2044. There's been a hiccup in the last 4 years in terms of our immigration numbers, but somewhere between 2042 and 2044, the United States will become a majority people of color. In California, Californians already have people of color. So like, this is not an intellectual exercise at this point. This is just math, right? This is just demographics. And I just want to say it in that really kind of flattened scientific way. So then when you're thinking about Jewish people of color, what this chart shows you, starting in the 1930s, when we started to collect data in the United States around Jews, what our researchers have been able to identify is, over time, this is what's called cohort replacement. And every next generation of Jewish babies born in the United States is more racially diverse than the cohort before them. And so the physics tells us, and the data tells us, that every generation next is more racially diverse. And so the beautiful batch of Jewish babies that were born yesterday in the United States, the ones born today are going to be more racially hued than yesterday. So every day over time, our community is becoming more racially diverse. And this is not an intellectual exercise about someday the US Jewish community will be racially diverse. This is math. And the math tells us, we don't know the exact date, but by cohort replacement, we know without a doubt that the US Jewish community every day is becoming more racially diverse. We're already something like 12 to 15%. And over the arc of time, we too, which is amazing and perfect and exactly the promise of the United States, we too will become a majority people of color. And so why does any of this matter? Why should we care? Why should we be interested? And let me say it like this, and I appreciate Rabbi Shmuley, thank you for your Torah. If it was just Jewish values, right? Like if we were just compelled to be good people and to not be racist, we wouldn't be here together, right? Like George Floyd wouldn't have been murdered, right? And our community leadership, our community organizations would reflect the diversity of the Jewish people. And so if it was just like us relying on being good people and good Jewish values, we wouldn't be in this conversation. So clearly we need more. We need more. And so we need to remember that, like, we right now in the organized Jewish communal space, we lack the leadership capacity to see and support the full Jewish community. Full stop. Full stop. We cannot accept a structure where white people universally speak on behalf of Jewish people of color. We cannot accept a structure where white people universally lead our organizations on behalf of everybody, not because our white colleagues aren't amazing, that is not the issue, but we cannot reflect the perspectives, the experiences, the needs of Jewish people of color unless Jewish people of color are speaking and leading for ourselves. Unless we are speaking, and that means alongside all of the colleagues, it doesn't mean replacing them, but it certainly needs that Jewish people of color need to be in our own leadership roles and being part of the leadership cohort of this larger community. We need, yeah.
Ilana, really quickly, sorry to interrupt you. Is there a way we can make, because we get cut off on part of the slide. Is there a way we can see all of it? It cuts off right on like on the side.
Maybe, I mean, give me 2 seconds. I don't know, Eddie, sorry. What part can you not see?
Shahana said that if you try control and minus, it should help. But it was cutting off on like right where privilege on where we talked about privilege and hoarding. We were unable to see the rest of it.
Can you still see my screen now? Are you just seeing the open deck?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Can we just go like this so I don't keep tinkering and keep going? Okay.
That works for me.
Okay, Linda,
Yes.
I see you nodding your head affirmatively, and I appreciate that. So thank you. And again, I apologize for any technical stuff. Okay, so the other piece is that like people, we are curating spaces in our Jewish community without the diversity of perspectives we need to curate the spaces. And what I mean by that is when you are in diverse spaces, and think about this as if you were environments that at one point were all men and evolved into being with women, if you were environments that like had one group and then expanded to others, the aesthetic changes, the vibe changes, the energy changes. And that's a really good thing. But we can't gracefully create that kind of change unless people are in the spaces to help us with that. And right now, all of our spaces are overwhelmingly curated with whiteness. And that can't be welcoming for everybody. And I know that for some, it feels like leaving or letting go of tradition. And tradition sometimes is a euphemism in some ways for how we think about whiteness. But what I want to assure you of is this is not about closing one chapter and opening another. It's about the extension of our story. And our story was that in the 1600s, certain Jews came here and we looked one way. And then the first wave of Jewish immigration came and we looked one way. And then the second wave of Jewish immigration came and we looked one way, but that is not the end of the story. And so we need to curate our community with the expanded story. And we need to have role models in our community who can support the expanded story and who can help our young people who want to be in this community reach for visions of themselves. We need to be able to say to those young people who want to be a rabbi, like, yeah, there are 5 great rabbis of color for you to talk with about their experience. And they need those opportunities as much as any one of us were inspired to be whatever we are because we had our own role models. We need to move into a different kind of space of obligation. Again, if Jewish values were enough, we wouldn't be here. And so what is it that actually obligates any one of you to the work? Like literally, what is it? What is it? Have you had that conversation with yourself? Have you had that conversation with somebody else? Have you challenged yourself around what obligates you to the work? And then I would say that, of course, the other side of that is what holds you accountable? The Jewish community is not going to hold you accountable to being anti-racist. The Jewish community is not going to demand of you that your communities reflect the racial diversity of our community. The Jewish community is not going to invite you to do that because there are physics around it that actually, in some ways, don't make this our core priority. But you have an invitation to be an anchor or to continue to being an anchor in the kind of change that's required in this community. And the only way you're going to do it is if we obligate and are accountable. And I would say the last piece of accountability is to say that out loud, right? Like say it out loud. Who are you being accountable to? How are you doing it? How can you hold that space? It's all really important. The last piece of the slide that's really important is like, we need to appreciate that it is up to us to reveal who hasn't been counted, who hasn't been seen, who's not been acknowledged as part of our community. It's a crime of omission to not count everybody. And I'm using count now as a metaphor. Like when you're doing your work, when you're building your organizations, when you're building your community, it is up to each one of you to make sure everyone is counted. No one's going to hold you accountable to that either. But I would push that even further and say, not only do you have to be positioned to make sure you're counting everyone, but that last little piece, and there's a little bit of like Babylonian Talmud that supports this, because our imaginations are limited, because our worldviews have been informed by racism, we are not able to see everybody. Not any one of us is able to count everybody. And so beyond going in with the commitment to be like, darn it, I'm going to make sure everyone is counted, even the people who are traditionally not counted, each one of us has to go further and say, and I have to make holy space for the reality that my imagination can't imagine everyone out there. And so how do I say, like, did I miss you? Did I see you? For those we can't imagine, so we can't count up front. And then we need to move into a space where we get closer and closer and closer to being anti-racist. And Rabbi Shmuley also set that up for us. And so in very simple terms, between racist and anti-racist is not non-racist or neutral racist, or even like being well-meaning. It's just racist. Being an anti-racist means not only raising consciousness about race and racism, but in the face of racism, being an anti-racist requires you to take concrete action. It requires an intentionality about your approach to everything you do. It requires consciousness and knowledge to be able to scan for racism and be able to identify it when it happens. And being an anti-racist is a verb, the same way being Jewish should be a verb. But being an anti-racist means when you see something, you do something. And it's never enough to go, that racist thing that just happened was terrible. It's never enough to stop at terrible. It's a privilege to get to stop at terrible because it tells you that something inside of you is not afraid of the racism, is not vulnerable to the racism. And that should be a little flag for you. When you see something racist and you're not afraid, when you see something racist and you're not feeling vulnerable, that's a sign of privilege for you. And that should be even more motivation to interrupt it and to do something about it. And I'm going to leave you with 4 things we can do right now, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Eddie. First, I want us to continue to begin to move deeper into reflecting on the roots of privilege and wealth. And I'm putting that in like one big juicy resource bucket. And I want you to get real with if your privilege, if your wealth, if your power has come to you in some kind of unearned way, particularly if that comes to you at the cost of people of color. If your power, your privilege, your wealth results from extracting a resource, labor, land, time, expertise from people of color. And if you haven't started your conversation there, that's a really important place to start. And when you have that conversation, it invites you to reflect and to look at making repair. And repairing those relationships becomes infrastructure for your own work around racial justice and equity. Number 2, I want us all to get clear on our value proposition for working and leading in multiracial, multi-ethnic, anti-racist ways. And I want you to share your value proposition proudly and publicly and boldly out there, because that's what leaders do. And leaders who share their values inspire others to participate. And when I'm talking about your value proposition, again, I'm going to say it over and over and over again. Like if racism was bad, was enough, brown and black people would not be at risk in this country to be murdered. Brown and black people in this community would not be at risk to be racially profiled. Brown and black people and people of color in the Jewish community would be fully integrated, and our community would reflect in multiracial, anti-racist ways. And so until then, what is going to not only motivate you to obligate and be accountable to this work, but what's going to actually lock you in? Is it the demographic numbers? Like, are you just a math person? And you're looking at their numbers and you're scratching out a formula while I'm talking, and you're looking at like when we're going to become a majority of people of color in the US Jewish community. And you're like, oh my goodness, if we don't do something right now in 5 years and 7 years and 10 years and 20 years, here's what's going to happen. We're going to look like a state where white people lead a majority of people of color. And we should be intensely uncomfortable with that. Right? So maybe it's just the numbers for you. Maybe you're a person of text, and somewhere in text you have a halakhic mandate to be anti-racist, and your Torah is intertwined with that. Then you need to get out there and preach that. And you need to get out there and lead that and give people access to that same Torah. If it's because this is about you and your family, this is your life. This is not a hypothetical situation. This is not an intellectual exercise. Like, this is the air you breathe. This is the water you drink. And this is about not only the safety of your family, but your right to Torah, which is really what this is about in the Jewish community. Then get out there and get clear on that and say that and invite people to join you in that. But we all have to have a reason why we do this. What's pushing us, what's motivating us, and what's not only motivating us, but tethering us to our work. Number 3, get so clear, get honest about, like, if you just stop now, if you do nothing more than what you're doing right now, what's at stake? Well, what's at stake is the diversity of our community will not come closer to our community. We will be pushed away, because we haven't remedied the headwinds of racism yet in our community. What's at stake from my perspective is the entire US Jewish community. Because I do believe that racism is the headwind to community engagement. And it's funny because I used to work at a federation. We track all the engagement. There's nothing but young adult engagement opportunities in the Jewish community, right? There's nothing but opportunities to engage in Jewish community life. If engagement were the issue, Jewish community would be bustling. Racism is the issue. And until we deal with racism, we are separating out our multiracial families from our larger community. We are challenging Jews of color to say, come in, but come in despite these headwinds of racism. Come in anyway. And that's not actually a warm invitation. The warm invitation is, we get it. Racism has stymied our community. It's arrested our development. And when we fully embrace who we are as anti-racist, we appreciate that this community will be transformed. And that's what this is about, because everybody will be able to come home, whatever home means to them. And then finally, with absolute rigor and discipline and vigor, do all you can to actively apply multiracial, anti-racist tools, skills, and thinking to make your Jewish work just. And I put that word philanthropy there for a reason. I'm not talking about giving away money. I'm talking about the common good and common care for our neighbors, right? Like, going back to kind of the Latin roots, I'm talking about the goodwill to lift up all of our neighbors and friends. And we will only be able to do this with knowledge. We will only be able to do this with understanding, how does racism really play out in the interpersonal realms, the cultural realms, the institutional realms? And then how do we transform that with tools of anti-racism? And what do I need to read? And what do I need to think about? What do I need to listen to give me not only like the inspiration and the invitation to do this work, but the competency? And with competency comes confidence, the competency to do this work. And we need to make this work as important as managing our budgets. We need to make this work as important as strategic planning. We need to make this work as important as the care and maintenance of our buildings. the care and maintenance of our people. And so with that, I will stop sharing the screen however it looks, and I'll get some help with that, Eddie, and then I'm going to pass it back to you and we can do some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilana, for that. That was really great. So now, folks, part of our Early Aesthetics anti-racism campaign, and part of this campaign was to truly not only educate us, motivate us, but to give us clear and concrete asks and answers. So now is a portion of discussion and Q&A that we really want to focus folks, ask those really hard, uncomfortable questions that lead to uncomfortable conversations. I believe that in the progressive movement, we love to say that we are having uncomfortable conversations, but the majority of the time we preach to each other. And we are scared to even approach these conversations. And I know Ilana is very good at like, let's dive in here. Let's talk about this. So go ahead and ask your questions in the chat. I'm gonna start off with a question here, Ilana. And it says, while the Jewish philanthropic world and other organized Jewish communities should support the Jews, and truthfully all others who experience racism and or isms of any kind, I don't understand why Jews of color who are part of the Jewish community and are middle class, not economically or socially left out, should get a particular part of the Jewish philanthropic pie. Unless we are talking about reparations, specifically within the Jewish world, I don't get it.
Okay, I appreciate the question. And so let's back out like 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet. If you are engaged in Jewish communal life, particularly people of wealth in the Jewish community, in fact, you get a disproportionate amount of resources from the Jewish community. And so it's a fallacy to suggest like Jews who are economically disadvantaged or have lesser access to wealth receive the greater proportion of Jewish communal philanthropy. So the question is based on a fallacy, and I just want to gently interrupt that. If you actually look at the use of funds across Jewish community philanthropy, I would say, and again, like I don't have time to do the analysis for you right now, but if you participate in Jewish community life, if you participate in a synagogue, if you go to a JCC, if you go to Jewish communal organizations, if you participate in any kind of Jewish communal traditional life, those resources come from Jewish community philanthropy. And if you look at who is more served in terms of proportion, frequency, opportunities for access, it's certainly not Jews of color and poor Jews who are like taking up all the space in Jewish communal life. Right? Like when you look at boards, when you look at lay leaders, where all those resources go, there's disproportionate wealth and it's disproportionately white. And so I just have to lovingly and gently push back on your frame. And so Jews of color in general receive the least resources proportional to population because of the racism. And I've already framed that out. But, and so I guess I would end just by saying like, sure, in a philanthropic context, those with greatest financial need and resource need should receive the funds. There's really no evidence to suggest that Jewish community philanthropy works that way. There's a lot of resources that do go to Jews who need support, like through Jewish Family Children's Services, through the Hebrew Free Loan Association, but that's a minority of the Jewish population relative to the rest of the population who's engaged in Jewish life and those who receive support through philanthropy. That philanthropy will be indirectly supporting you, but kind of everything you do in Jewish community, all PJ Library, all of these things, they're not actually catered toward poor Jewish people or people of color.
Thank you, Ilana. I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask a question, Ilana, here. What do you say to folks who say, well, we Ashkenazi Jews had it bad. We had it bad here. We're not talking about how bad we had it when we migrated here. We suffer just as much as JOCs suffer now. Why are we highlighting JOCs? Why don't we all just call each other Jewish? Why should we separate and divide and call ourselves JOCs? We've been through the same sort of oppression, and we want to just unite together and just be called Jewish.
I appreciate the question, Eddie. I mean, a couple of different layers. First of all, like Jews of color as a group, like Jews of color calling ourselves Jews of color. First of all, like people get to self-identify in that way. And I said that earlier, but Jews of color as a group, people of color as a group can stop existing when we stop creating a baseline of whiteness or when white stops being the norm. And so, you know, it's very, very important in that question to understand how the United States has created race identity structures and how those race identity structures have informed everything we do in this country, including the structure of Jewish communal life. And so I appreciate the question, and acknowledging the history of the United States in terms of race and racism doesn't in any way compete with or mitigate the experiences of the diversity of Jews who came to this country. It's not only Ashkenazim who have had our own experience of either pogroms, the Holocaust, migration, immigration, and emigration. What about our Bukharian family? What about our family from countries in the Middle East who have been under attack for years and years and generations and decades? And so even to sort of frame that question around like, what about the Ashkenazi story? Again, misses the greater diversity in the community and all of the experiences, the challenging experiences being marginalized, the experience of being colonized, that inform the different Jewish communities' experiences here in the United States. So again, I want to expand what you're asking around that. Lastly, if just being Jewish, just like just Jewish values of just being Jewish was inclusive, anti-racist, welcoming, inviting of the diversity of the Jewish community, then just being Jewish would be enough to create Jewish communities that reflected the racial diversity of our community. Just being Jewish, which is a euphemism, it's shorthand for Ashkenazi. It's shorthand for being framed by whiteness. If just being Jewish were enough, then we would see a robust, multi-ethnic, multiracial, intact, thriving US Jewish community. And so without criticism, let's pause as scholars, right? Like just let's pause as scholars. My last point with rigor. Let's pause as scholars and go, it wasn't enough. Like whatever it wasn't enough. And let's reflect on what got in the way. Just being Jewish meant just being white. That's hard for Jews of color and our multiracial Jewish families. Just being Jewish means a flattened version of Ashkenazi identity. That's unwelcoming, and it actually like consolidates rather than expands the broad Jewish ethnicity of our diversity, of our Jewish community in the United States. I will end by saying, I appreciate that just being Jewish might feel easier. It might feel more efficient. It might even feel more welcoming. Like if we could just all get around this theme, then everybody could come in and have access. Unfortunately, unless just being Jewish is informed by the racial diversity of the Jewish community, if just being Jewish, if that definition isn't informed by the multiplicities of ethnicities in our communities, if just being Jewish isn't informed by the broad diversity of gender identity in our communities, then just being Jewish will limit who we can think of and the expansiveness of our Jewish community. And I think that would be a lost opportunity.
Thank you so much. In efforts to hear as many voices as possible, Ilana, how do you feel about if we ask folks to ask us their 3 questions and you answer them rapid fire, if possible?
Go ahead and drive, Eddie. I have a pen and notebook. Go ahead.
All righty. Okay, so folks, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question away. I want to hear your voices. This is a dialogue. This is a discussion. We want to hear your beautiful voices and want to feel that you're present here with us today. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions. We're going to go with 3 rapid fire questions for Ilana. Go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Hi, this is Sherry. I'll jump in. And I did write this in the chat. It's about the use of caucuses, which I think are really, really important. But I've been involved in both Jewish and non-Jewish formats where caucuses are used, and then there's no opportunity for the whites and blacks or people of color to actually meet and talk. And so my question is, how is that going to help specifically in the Jewish community if we continue to use caucuses, and what are we really doing to promote inclusivity within the Jewish community?
I appreciate the question, and by caucuses, I'm imagining you meaning like grouping by identity groups and various. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think there's. I mean, caucuses in the absence of sort of more diverse communities sometimes can be at odds, and so I appreciate your question, Sherry. I mean, I think about my amazing colleague Yvila McCoy, who's the CEO and founder of Dimensions, and one of the structures they offer, I mean, there are opportunities for just Jewish women of color, for example, to be together, but then those same collectives then sort of adjust and sort of move into spaces where it might be Jewish women of color and allies together. And so I think pedagogically, it's very important to have space for people to be in their own identity groups, whatever they are, and also to create, if that's your philosophy, then to also create opportunities for identity groups to then be expanded into diverse groups. That's a philosophical and sort of pedagogical decision, but I think like there are lots of great opportunities to both caucus, but then to collaborate, and we need skilled people to design that for us and to hold those opportunities so that they can be really both intentional and successful. So I think that's right on, and I think Dimensions has a wonderful, wonderful model of that in their JOC Allies Collective.
Thank you so much, Ilana. Yeah, Shahana posted in the chat that she does that type of caucusing in her racial justice work. I also want to shout out Shahana for being a mentor to me and an amazing teacher. Let's go with Linda. And remember, folks, ask your question really quick, and then we're going to move on to another question. That way, Ilana has the opportunity to hear as many voices as possible.
How do you keep, this is Bob, how do you keep groups from falling apart when somebody comes in with with provocative and perhaps hostile comments about, well, we Jews did it, and why can't you blacks, and that sort of thing that can break a group apart?
I love the question, and I say this with a little bit of a smile on my face. I mean, as Jewish people of color, we're always accustomed to people coming in with confusion or hostility or questions, whether it be about how we became Jewish or our Torah and content knowledge, or like misinformation about the Black Lives Matter movement, or misinformation about the perspectives of African Americans and anti-Semitism and Zionism. And so I think it's a regular and constant experience. And I think that probably there are parallel structures if you're Latino, or if however you identify in that capacity. I think there are parallel structures if you're Asian identified, Native identified. So as people of color, just like women who've experienced misogyny or sexism, or if you're LGBTQ and you've experienced homophobia or heteronormativity, I think we're all accustomed to the headwinds of hostility and confusion. Therefore, if we're choosing to be in this work, you have to have some resilience. I think you also have to have some compassion or some generosity. My perspective is when people come at us with hostility, they're coming with both the intersection of fear and misinformation, which are dangerous. It's a dangerous cocktail, fear and misinformation. But if we are in these roles, we are choosing to receive that fear and misinformation and receive it as such. Like, unless you're just truly hostile and you're truly a racist or you're truly a white supremacist, if in that case, there's no space for that in this movement, right? Because we want people to be together. But assuming goodwill, we have to be able to be the leaders and hold when people are skittish. We have to be able to leaders and hold when people are going to come at us with misinformation about race and racism. And we have to assume, because this country is so darn racist, that everybody has misinformation about people of color, the same way this country is so anti-Semitic that everybody has misinformation about Jews. But like, we just need to assume that. And if we are choosing to be in this space, we have to hold some compassion. We have to have skills in terms of our response. And we have to choose to bring people in rather than let them kind of flap in the wind out. When we have people who are misinformed, anxious, scared, and alone, they find allies who support that fear rather than bringing people together. And so it's an approach that requires some generosity, but all of the colleagues in this space, I think, are committed to the larger purpose in that way.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rabbi.
Bara. Anyway, hi. So these are sort of two connected questions, and they have to do with this concept of continuity, which is a big, perennial issue in Jewish published literature, i.e. the forward or stuff like that. And I'm thinking about the implicit veiled racism in continuity questions. That is to say that what we're really trying to preserve is this Ashkenazi normativity and make that. And I come with that. The reason I'm saying it's a related question is I'm thinking about conversion. I'm a convert to Judaism, and conversion was clearly into Ashkenazic Judaism. That wasn't even a question. And I didn't realize it wasn't a question until much later, when even going to rabbinical school, I ended up not going to one place because one of the things that was touted was, you'll come here and you'll get Yiddishkeit. as if, again, that is what it is to be Jewish. So I'm thinking, how do we disrupt that notion of continuity without disrupting the idea that we do in fact want continuity as a people, but not in necessarily this narrow framework, which I think is implicit, even though it's never stated.
Well, I mean, I love the question. And I think for the sake of your question, I will actually share a personal example. And I very rarely share personal things, but let me do this. So my mother's parents are from Poland and Romania. I grew up in San Francisco, California at a Reform synagogue since age 7. When I was born, my mother's family disowned us because we were Black, and did not come around. And so, to your point, until we became bar bat mitzvah, to kind of seal in our Jewish identity. They needed a stamp of approval that we were actually as Jewish as my mother said we would be. The relationships, and so this is a metaphor, right? Over the arc of the years, we were kind of estranged from that family. Fast forward to 2020, and one of my cousins leads one of the Jewish summer camps out there, and was sent some professional development materials that included my Eli talk about race and racism. When we think about continuity, the racism is so potent that we view particularly Black and brown people as an interrupter to Jewish continuity. And it is the racism that makes people wonder, like, can't you just be Jewish, right? Instead of assuming that we can be whole Jewish Black people, Black Jewish people, whatever it is, all at the same time. As if when you walk around, you can't be a woman and Jewish. As if you walk around and can't chew gum and walk at the same time, right? And so first of all, we need to stop patronizing people. And we need to stop matronizing people and assume we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, identity is intended to be whole. It's not intended to be cleaved. And so we have to assume we can be whole. That assumption has to be interrupted by anti-racist work. Again, racism and anti-Black and anti-brown racism in the United States is so potent that it is viewed as a disruptor to continuity. And when someone is in that moment of exploring that spiritually and intellectually, they can't see that the next generation is going to be reliant upon that relationship, upon our Black Jewish community, our people of color Jewish community being whole to actually move forward and do the work. They can't see the future or the now in that way, Rabbi. And so we have to actually talk about the racism. And I think the Forward's a really interesting example. Like, up until 10 years ago, it was published in Yiddish. Like, how, like, those roots are deep, deep, deep. And they also were raised on racism in the United States. And so, yeah, like, we need to be the interrupters. We cannot understate how potent racism is. And it is very hard, if racism has been your filter, to actually imagine, like, we're all going to be in a collegial conversation talking about Jewish texts, and some of us are going to be Black and some of us are going to be white. We're actually part of the same family having the same conversation. It's impossible to imagine if racism is that interruptive filter. I think I would end that by just saying the attachment to sort of the Yiddishkeit culture, that attachment comes with a fear of loss of that history. It comes with a fear of forgetting the Holocaust. It comes with a fear of forgetting the pogroms. And I think it is very important that we think about, like, if you're a Jew by choice, particularly an African-American woman from Atlanta, so I'm thinking about some of my colleagues and friends out there, I think we need to be curious about, and I'm undecided, like, how does, like, first of all, Jews who are born in the United States of 2 Jewish parents hardly know anything about Judaism, hardly know anything about Israel, hardly know anything about Palestine. And so, to what extent is what parts of our history important in a contemporary US Jewish context? I think we actually have to have that conversation. To what extent, like, do we understand that the pogroms as a historical concept is accessible by anybody? The pogroms as a personal concept is only accessible to those who have that experience. And that's like, we can't actually expect people to know that and to filter their Jewish experience through those lenses. We can't actually expect that. So I'll end by saying, you really do have to have not a reinvention of US Judaism, but an extension of our story so that everybody actually understands our history, our current contemporary identities, and it gives us a sense of potential and a sense of expansion about where we might go. Our tools have been very limited up to this point, and they stop us, and racism halts us.
Thank you. Thank you. Real quickly, Ilana, I know you've been trying to ask a question, so go ahead.
It's just a quick well, it's not a quick question. And actually listening to the last answer, it made me even sort of broaden the question out. Seemingly, some of the language that we've been using in this presentation, I'm sure is very resonant in non-halakhically oriented communities. But in the halakhically oriented communities, some of the things that were said, I think, are going to be particularly triggering. And in those communities, anti-racism is something deeply needed. So for example, Ashkenazi tradition is sort of seemingly equated with racism, which Ashka normativity is definitely a thing, but there's also Black people who are Ashkenazi, right? There was a phrase, I don't remember the exact phrasing, about that American Judaism is all about like sort of marrying out and getting diverse and things like that. And that's going to be very problematic and triggering in some communities. And it doesn't, like those are the very communities that need to be doing this work. And it seems to me that some of that language is actually undermining the work that needs to be done, that we need to find a way to speak in a way that doesn't automatically make people assume that you're saying, oh, it's actually strengthening the idea that lies under the racism, rather than saying that's nonsensical, that the Jewish tradition, halakha, actually is in itself anti-racist, and that when we are acting in racist ways, that actually is contrary to Jewish law. So I'm just saying, like, is there a better framing we can use about some of that?
So I appreciate your point, and I appreciate that it didn't all resonate with you. I actually work with a lot of Orthodox communities, and I use the language really consistently. And there's a philosophical and pedagogical reason why. The language that I use is universal language, and I think we spend a lot of time in various aspects or sort of strains or lanes of the Jewish community, taking language that's universal in the United States around race, racism, the movement, white supremacy, white nationalism. And some US Jews have a lot of discomfort with that language, and so want to shift the language to make it more metabolizable or understandable in their context. When we do that, from my perspective as a scholar, we dilute the meaning of the language, and we create a lack of opportunity to grow into universal language, and therefore we limit ourselves. I think it's very, very important from a pedagogical treatment to make sure work is grounded in tradition and grounded in language that communities can hear it. But I am very cautious to change language that has universal meaning to fit into specific Jewish contexts, because it actually changes the meaning of the language. I would rather struggle with you, Ilana, about the meaning of language than change language or adapt language to take away from its actual meaning. And again, like the initiative, this is our work. We've aligned this language with our work. It doesn't work for everybody, but I have used this in very, very traditional observant environments and communities. And where I will tell you kind of the difference is geography. And so like we work with a lot of Orthodox community in Baltimore, for example, and in the Washington, DC area. Because I think proximity to African Americans, quite frankly, and proximity to relationships in that way, like there seems to be more understanding sometimes. And so I would say like one of the interesting variables I found in working with the modern Orthodox and with the observant communities is around relationship to geography and context. And I would invite the grappling around language anytime, but the language of discourse matters. And it's important that Jews of color are able to claim our own language.
So let me I'm just going to push back just a little bit. I actually agree that universality of language is really important. It was actually some specific things. So for example, when you equate Ashkenazi tradition, like you actually use the word tradition as a synonym for racism, right? Which I actually, that seems to me as like a particular instance of undermining language. And I was wondering like what you think about that.
Look, well, I don't want, so I know where we are, but I'll just push. Tradition is a euphemism for culture, and culture is a euphemism for racism, because culture relies on people to interpret policy rather than policies to structure the people. And so culture is often racism, and we often perpetuate racism through culture. That's actually one of our most potent tools because it goes unchecked. And we say that's how we always are. And we say that's how we always do things. But when we say that, who is the we we're talking about? When we say we have shared values, who was around the table when the values were shared? And so I appreciate this conversation and I really welcome it. But I think tradition and culture mask racism. And until we interrogate, interrupt culture and say, actually, like that was your experience. But that's not a universal experience. I think we have to name tradition as a flag for a potent sort of vehicle for racism. And I appreciate the pushback. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much to both of you. I know that this conversation can go for hours and hours and hours, and this is why it is a key component of our work, both in Early Aesthetic and in partnership with Arizona Jews for Justice, to really continue this conversation. I loved what Ilana was talking about. Just as our Judaism is a verb, so is our work. So is our work to become anti-racist. So is our work to continue to push and continue to dismantle the systems that are in place that oppress our communities. Something that really came up about while I was listening to everybody's and to conclude here is something that Rav Menachem says, and it kind of goes on to this. He says, the awakening is caused by sacrifices in the resolutions for the world. Tikkun de Alam Ma. A blessing for all the worlds. To me, this shows that sometimes it takes sacrifice, and the sacrifice of our communities, sacrificing our times, our efforts to really get to know how we can evolve into a community of equity and not equality, of equity for all of us that works in systems that all of us can be joined into the table. I want to give a huge thank you to Ilana Kaufman, who always brings the most amazing conversations and dialogue. I want to give thank you to every single one of you who participated today, who brought in your true self into this program and was able to soak in and have dialogue with each other. Huge shout out to everybody who partook. Follow Early Aesthetic on earlyaesthetic.org for the recording of this. If you missed it, if you want to share it. Again, another huge thank you to everybody. Follow up with our project. We are trying to fill up a bus full of donations for asylum seekers at the border, and we need your help. There's hundreds of families that need your help. I will be emailing every single person who participated today with follow-ups on how you can help families today. Again, Ilana, thank you so much for this dialogue and much needed conversation. Everybody have an amazing holiday. May there be light in your darkness. May you perceive. If I don't get to see you, Shabbat Shalom.
Right on, Eddie. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Shmuley. Thank you, everybody. It's my privilege.
Take care.
Thank you.